Before we begin, I need you to stop what you're doing. Put down your phone, close the other tabs, take one breath in, and slowly let it out. Because what I'm about to say, you may have waited your entire life to hear. You were not crazy. You were not too sensitive. You were not the problem. And the person who let you believe you were wasn't your parent. It was the sibling sitting right next to you. The one who saw everything and said nothing. Fades in soft, atmospheric. The wound no one names. There's a betrayal we talk about in hushed tones, if we talk about it at all. Not the parent who raged, controlled, manipulated. Not the narcissist who rewrote reality until you couldn't recognize your own memories. We expect that wound. We have names for it. Books, therapists, support groups. We've slowly started to build a language around that pain. But there's another wound. Quieter, softer edged, and somehow more confusing to carry. It's the wound of the sibling who watched, who sat beside you at the dinner table when the air grew sharp and thin, who heard the yelling from the other room, who was there the day you were torn apart in front of everyone, and who looked away. Maybe they even laughed. Maybe they sided with the parent. Maybe they became the parent's voice in the room, echoing back the same cruelties in a slightly softer tone. You've been carrying that for years, maybe for decades. And here is what I want you to understand, that ache you've been feeling. The one that lives a little differently than the main trauma, the one that surfaces when your sibling texts you a casual message as if nothing ever happened. That ache is real, it is legitimate, and it has a name. It's called sibling betrayal. And in families shaped by narcissistic abuse, it may be the most under-acknowledged wound of all. Pause swells softly. Let's sit with something for a moment. Think back to a specific time, a moment when you needed someone, anyone, to stand up for you, to say something, to look at you with eyes that said, I see what's happening. You're not alone. Can you remember that moment? Don't rush it. Let it come. Now, where was your sibling in that memory? Not where you wish they were, where they actually were. That gap between where they were and where you needed them to be, that's the terrain we're exploring today. The myth of the shared wound. We've been told a beautiful story about siblings who survive difficult families. That trauma bonds people together. That going through something hard, side by side, creates a kind of unshakable closeness. That even if the outside world doesn't understand what your family was like, at least your sibling gets it, because they were there. But here is what that story doesn't account for. In narcissistic family systems, siblings don't just share a wound. They're sorted into roles. The golden child, chosen, protected, praised, given access to warmth and approval, but always on condition of loyalty. The scapegoat, blamed, criticized, made responsible for the family's tension. The one who carries the weight that belongs to the whole system. The invisible child, who learned early that the safest thing to do was to shrink, to disappear, to need nothing. These roles were not chosen by accident. They were assigned by the narcissistic parent as a means of control, and within that assignment, something devastating happened between siblings. Instead of becoming allies, you became competitors. Not necessarily in a loud, obvious way, but in the deep structural sense. You were competing for safety, for approval, for enough oxygen to survive. Your sibling wasn't just your sibling. They were a mirror of what you could have been if you'd been chosen differently, or a reminder of what you'd lost by being assigned the harder role. And over time, the gap between you, the gap that should have been filled with loyalty and protection, got filled with something else. It got filled with the family system itself. Shift, slightly heavier tone. Psychologist Alice Miller wrote something that has stayed with me. The truth about our childhood is stored in the body, and although we can repress it, we can never alter it. Your body remembers what it felt like when your siblings sided with the parent, when they minimized what happened to you, when they smiled as you were being humiliated. That wasn't a small thing. That was your nervous system recording in real time. Even the person beside me won't protect me. Even the person who knows exactly what's happening won't speak. That recording doesn't erase with time. It goes underground, and it shapes often invisibly the way you relate to people for the rest of your life. The psychology of the enabler. Let me paint a picture for you. You are 8 years old, maybe 9. Dinner is quiet in the way that quiet becomes threatening, the way you've learned to read the tension in the air, the way a sailor reads the sky before a storm. Your parent's voice tightens. The criticism begins. Directed at you, as it so often is. The words are cutting. The message underneath them is clear. You are the problem. You are always the problem. And in that moment, you do what you've always done. You look to your sibling, not with expectation exactly, more with hope, the fragile, desperate hope that someone in this room will see you, that someone will say, hey, wait, that's not fair. But your sibling looks down at their plate, or they nod along, or they laugh just slightly at the joke made at your expense, and something in you goes very, very quiet. Not quiet like peace, quiet like shutdown. What happened in that moment from a psychological standpoint is deeply important to understand, because understanding it doesn't excuse it. But it does help explain something that can otherwise feel like pure evil, and in understanding it, we can stop taking it quite so personally. What your sibling did was choose survival, not consciously. Perhaps, not with malicious calculation, but in the instinctive animal sense that every child navigates in a home where love is weaponized. They aligned with power to stay safe. This is what psychologists call identification with the aggressor, a defense mechanism first described by Anna Freud. When a child cannot fight back against a threatening authority figure and cannot flee, they do the next adaptive thing. They become like that authority figure. They adopt their language, their perspective, even their cruelty. Not because they're bad children, but because they're scared children trying to predict an unpredictable environment. But here is where it becomes more complex, because that survival choice gets rewarded. Every time your siblings sided with the parent, they received something: approval, reduced scrutiny, maybe even affection. The narcissistic parent noticed their loyalty and gave them more of what every child is starving for in those homes: safety. So the behavior deepened, the alliance strengthened, and gradually, what started as survival became identity. Your sibling didn't just learn how to survive the narcissist, they learned to become useful to the narcissist. Pause softens. Gabor Mate, in his work on trauma and development, offers this insight. Children will choose attachment over authenticity every time. What does that mean here? It means your sibling may have abandoned their own truth, their own capacity for empathy, their own relationship with you. In order to maintain connection with the parent, they chose attachment to the power source over authenticity to what they actually saw, felt, and knew was happening. And in doing so, they traded you, not in a loud, deliberate way, but trade by trade, silence by silence, turn cheek by turn cheek. They gave away the sibling relationship, piece by piece, in exchange for proximity to power. The mechanics of betrayal, I want to be precise here because this is where the wound actually lives. It's not just that your sibling didn't help you. It's what they actively did that made things worse. The enabler sibling doesn't just stand back and watch. In narcissistic family systems, they often become a functional extension of the narcissist's control. And they do it in ways that are difficult to name in the moment, which is part of what makes it so destabilizing. They become the translator. When the narcissist's cruelty is too naked, too obvious to defend on its own terms, the enabler sibling reframes it. That's just how dad is. Mom didn't mean it that way. You're too sensitive. They take your legitimate pain and run it through a filter that returns it to you as a character flaw. They become the witness who doesn't witness. Not only do they fail to confirm what you experience, they actively produce a counter-narrative. You come to them days later and say, "What happened at dinner last week was not okay." And they look at you, almost genuinely confused, and say, "I don't remember it like that." They become the enforcer of silence. Can you please just not make this into a thing? Why do you always have to bring this up? You're going to start a whole fight. The message, delivered in a tone that sounds almost reasonable, is clear. Your truth is disruptive. Your pain creates problems. Silence is the price of peace. And over time, this is important, you internalize those messages. You began to question your own memories. You began to shrink your own pain. You began to pre-edit yourself before you even spoke. The gaslighting didn't only come from the narcissistic parent. It came from the sibling sitting beside you, in the bedroom you may have shared, in the car on the way to school, at every family holiday table year after year after year. Reflective pause. I want to invite you to hold something right now. Not to reopen the wound for its own sake, but to see it clearly, perhaps for the first time. Where did you learn to doubt yourself? Was there a specific moment with your sibling where your version of events got overwritten? Where your reaction was called overreaction? Where your memory was labeled wrong? You don't need to share this with anyone, but let yourself know it. Because for many survivors, the sibling betrayal isn't a single dramatic moment. It's 1,000 small moments of being told, what you see is not real, what you feel is not valid. What happened to you is not what happened. That is not just family dysfunction. That is a systematic erosion of your relationship with your own mind. And it matters. The double grief. Here's what I want to say to you now, and I want you to receive it as gently as it's intended. You've been grieving two things at once. And most people around you, maybe even most of your own awareness, has only recognized one of them. The first grief is the one we're more familiar with. The grief of the childhood you deserved and didn't get. The parent who should have loved you without conditions. The home that should have been safe. That grief is real, significant, and it deserves all the space it needs. But there's a second grief that runs quietly alongside it, sometimes mistaken for bitterness. for pettiness, for the inability to just let it go. It's the grief of the sibling relationship you were supposed to have, the one that, in a different family, in a different system, might have been your greatest source of comfort and alliance. The sibling who should have been in the foxhole with you, who should have squeezed your hand under the dinner table, who should have caught your eye across the room and communicated, silently, "I see it too, I've got you." That sibling didn't exist. And mourning them, mourning the relationship that was never permitted to grow into what it could have been, that is a legitimate and profound grief. You have the right to grieve that, without guilt, without explaining yourself, without having to make it fair to them by immediately adding, "But they had their own pain too." Yes, they may have had their own pain, that's likely true, and their pain does not cancel yours. Holding both things simultaneously, their suffering and their choices, is not contradiction, it's complexity, and you are allowed to live in that complexity without resolving it into a verdict that erases what you experienced. When waiting becomes self-abandonment, let me ask you something that might sting a little. Are you still waiting? Not in an obvious way, maybe not even consciously, but somewhere, underneath the surface, is there still a part of you waiting for your sibling to wake up, to call you one day and say, "I've been thinking about how things were. I saw more than I let on. I should have stood up for you. I'm sorry." If that fantasy lives in you, and for many survivors it does, I need you to see it clearly, not to shame it. That longing is not weakness. That longing is grief, in one of its most tender and painful forms. But here is what I want you to consider. The fantasy of your sibling's awakening is, in a very real sense, a way of keeping yourself hostage to their choices. As long as your healing depends on their acknowledgement, your healing remains in their hands. And if your healing is in their hands, you're still inside the family system. You've left the house. Maybe you've gone low contact or no contact. Maybe you've done years of therapy. But if some essential part of your peace is still waiting on a moment that may never come, then that part of you is still sitting at that dinner table looking to the sibling beside you for a signal that it's safe to be yourself. Pause, sustained silence. Viktor Frankl wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." Here is the situation. You may never get the apology. The acknowledgement may never come. Your sibling may go to their grave defending the family narrative, protecting the myth, unable or unwilling to pay the price that truth would cost them. That is devastating to sit with. But here is what I also know to be true. The moment you stop needing them to confirm your reality is the moment you get your reality back. Not because you stop caring, not because the pain disappears, but because you become the author of your own story again. That authorship was taken from you, piece by piece, over years. It is yours to reclaim. What healing actually looks like, I want to be honest with you about what healing from this specific wound looks like, because I think we do survivors a disservice when we make it sound like a destination rather than a practice. Healing from sibling betrayal is not reaching a place where you feel nothing when they text you. It's not finding a way to feel grateful for the experience. It's not achieving forgiveness on a timeline that satisfies someone else. Healing looks more like this. It is learning to trust the record of your own experience, to stop editing your memories through the lens of what they told you happened. It is developing slowly and with great care the ability to extend to yourself the witness you never received from them. To look at the child you were in those moments and say, "I see you. I believe you. What happened to you was real, and it was not okay." It is setting boundaries, not as punishment, not out of cruelty, but as an act of self-respect. The boundary that says, "I will not re-enter conversations that require me to minimize my own experience." It is grieving, fully and without rush, the sibling you needed, the relationship that never got to be what it should have been, the years spent waiting for a validation that didn't come, the energy spent doubting yourself when you should have been living. Simone Weil once wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. For most of your life, that attention, the genuine witnessing, "I see you fully" kind, was withheld from you. Now it's time to learn to give it to yourself. What would that look like? It might look like pausing when you feel yourself minimizing your pain and asking, "What would I say to a close friend who described these exact same experiences?" It might look like writing, giving your story back to yourself on paper, in your own words, without the editorial oversight of the family narrative. It might look like therapy with someone who understands complex family trauma, who can help you sort through what's yours, what was placed there by others, and what you like to carry going forward. It might look like chosen family people who offer the kind of witnessing, steadiness, and loyalty that your sibling of childhood never could. Releasing the role here is something worth sitting with as we move toward the end of today's conversation. You were given a role in your family, And that role did not ask for your consent, whether you were the scapegoat, the invisible one, the difficult child, the one who was always too much. That role was assigned. It was enforced. It was maintained in part by your siblings' participation in the system. But here is the liberating and also terrifying truth. You can step out of that role. Not by pretending it didn't shape you. It did. Profoundly. The ways it shaped you will take time to understand and integrate, but you can begin, right now, to separate yourself from the story the family told about you. Jung said, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." Awakening here means seeing the role clearly, how it was constructed, by whom, for whose benefit, understanding that the role was a survival adaptation, not a definition, and beginning, however slowly, to author a different story, a truer story, a story where you are not the problem, where your feelings were always legitimate, where the child you were deserved so much more than they received. That child is still in you, still holding those dinner table moments, those silent car rides, those holidays where you smiled through gritted teeth and told yourself it wasn't that bad. It was that bad, and that child deserves to be told so. A word about forgiveness. I want to address forgiveness directly, because it will come up. It always does. Maybe it already has, from a well-meaning therapist, a spiritual teacher, a relative who says, "But forgiveness is for you, not for them." And there is something true in that. But here is what I want to be careful about. Forgiveness, when offered prematurely before the full weight of the betrayal has been acknowledged and grieved, becomes another way of silencing yourself. If you forgive before you've allowed yourself to be angry truly, validly angry, then you've skipped a step, and skipping that step doesn't heal the wound. It seals over it. Anger, in the context of abuse and betrayal, is not a problem to be solved. It's information. It's the nervous system's way of saying, "What happened to me was not okay. I deserved better. My well-being mattered and it was not protected." Let yourself feel that anger, not to hurt your sibling, not to extract revenge, but because you have a right to the full emotional truth of your own story. Forgiveness, if and when it comes, should be the organic result of a full reckoning, not a shortcut around it. And some betrayals may never reach forgiveness in the traditional sense, and that is allowed. What matters is not whether you forgive. What matters is whether you free yourself. Freedom from needing them to change. Freedom from needing them to see what you see. Freedom from waiting. Freedom from the role they assigned you. That freedom is available to you, not because the past changes, but because you finally stop needing it to. The revolution of being seen. Before we close today, I want to do something a little different. I want to speak directly to the version of you that first encountered this pain. The child at that dinner table. The teenager who learned to make themselves invisible. The young adult who kept trying to reconnect, hoping something had shifted, and kept coming home to find it hadn't. I want to say this to you. You were not too much. You were not too sensitive. You were not the chaos. You were a child in a chaotic system, doing everything right and being told you were doing everything wrong. The sibling who should have stood beside you had their own fear, their own adaptation, their own impossible position in an impossible family. That doesn't make what they did okay, but it does mean their silence was about the system, not about your worth. You were always worth defending. The problem was never you. Builds gently, and now, today, as an adult carrying all of that history forward into a life you are still building, I want to offer you this. The healing doesn't require their participation. You don't need them to remember it right. You don't need them to feel remorse. You don't need them to show up differently at the next holiday. You need you. You need the part of yourself that has been waiting patiently and achingly for someone to finally, fully, undeniably say, "I see you. I believe you." You were right to feel what you felt, and you are allowed to take up space. That voice doesn't have to come from outside anymore. At full, then slowly fades before you click away. I want to leave you with something to sit with. If you could speak to the child version of yourself in one of those hard moments, the dinner table, the car ride, the moment after the blow-up when everyone went quiet and pretended to move on, what would you say? Not what you wish you'd done differently, not an analysis of the family dynamics. Just, what would you say to that child? Write it down somewhere. Say it out loud. Let yourself hear it. Because that is the beginning. Not the ending, but the beginning of treating yourself the way you always deserve to be treated. With witness, with truth, with love that doesn't cost you yourself.